In the summer of 1536, Brother Thomas stood at the gates of Glastonbury Abbey, watching smoke rise from the scriptorium, where centuries of sacred manuscripts were being burned. Ancient volumes chronicling the lives of saints, illuminated psalters crafted by generations of devoted scribes, and texts preserving classical knowledge from Rome itself were being fed to the flames by men who couldn't even read Latin. The monastery that had stood for over 600 years, that had sheltered kings and crowned saints, was being systematically destroyed by men who called themselves servants of God. The very stones seemed to weep as the commissioners stripped lead from the roof, melted down silver chalices, and ordered the destruction of stained glass windows that had taken decades to complete. Within 3 years, over 800 monasteries across England would be suppressed, their wealth seized, their monks scattered to the winds like leaves in an autumn storm. This wasn't just religious reform, this was the greatest act of cultural vandalism in English history, ordered by a king whose desperation for a male heir would reshape an entire nation. The wealth that Henry seized would amount to nearly £1.3 million in Tudor currency, equivalent to billions today, making it one of the largest transfers of property in European history. But what drove Henry VIII to destroy institutions that had been the backbone of English society for a millennium? To understand the catastrophe that was about to unfold, we must first understand what medieval England was losing. Monasteries weren't just religious buildings, they were the hospitals, the schools, the libraries, and the social safety net of medieval society. When a peasant fell ill, it was the monastery infirmary that treated him with remedies preserved from classical antiquity and folk wisdom passed down through generations of healing brothers. When a noble's son needed education, it was the monastery school that taught him not just Latin and theology, but mathematics, astronomy, and the art of governance that would prepare him for leadership. When travelers needed shelter, when widows needed support, when orphans needed homes, it was the monasteries that opened their doors without question or payment. These ancient institutions controlled nearly a third of all land in England, making them collectively wealthier than the crown itself, yet they used this wealth not for personal luxury, but for the common good. The Benedictines with their emphasis on scholarship and learning, the Cistercians with their agricultural innovations and engineering marvels, the Franciscans with their dedication to the poor, and dozens of other orders had woven themselves so deeply into the fabric of English life that their destruction would leave wounds that never fully healed. At Canterbury Cathedral Priory, monks maintained one of Europe's greatest libraries, containing works by ancient philosophers that would otherwise have been lost forever. At St. Bartholomew's in London, the brothers operated England's oldest hospital, treating rich and poor alike without discrimination. With the case for keeping the monasteries apparently so strong, it was reasonable to question the king's state of mind, but his actions were not without precedent. When Henry began his systematic dissolution of English monasteries in the 1530s, he wasn't operating in a vacuum. Across continental Europe, the winds of religious and political change had already begun dismantling the medieval monastic system that had dominated European society for nearly a millennium. The most significant precedent came from the German states, where the Protestant Reformation had already set a powerful example. As early as the 1520s, Lutheran princes began secularizing monastic properties within their territories. In Saxony, Elector John Frederick systematically dissolved monasteries and convents, redistributing their lands to support Protestant churches and schools. The legal justification was simple, yet revolutionary. If these religious houses served a false religion, then their continued existence was not only unnecessary, but actively harmful to the spiritual welfare of the people. Perhaps more influential was the example of Sweden under King Gustav Vasa. Between 1527 and 1540, Gustav orchestrated one of the most thorough dissolutions of monastic property in European history. The Swedish king didn't just close monasteries, he created an entirely new economic foundation for royal power. Monastic lands, which had comprised nearly 20% of Sweden's territory, were transferred to the crown. The wealth generated allowed Gustav to fund a professional army, build a modern navy, and establish Sweden as a major European power. For Henry VIII, watching from across the North Sea, the Swedish model offered a tantalizing blueprint for strengthening royal authority while weakening potential sources of opposition. The Holy Roman Empire presented a more complex picture. Here, the process was fragmented across hundreds of individual principalities, each making its own decisions about monastic properties. Some Catholic princes actually strengthened their monasteries as bulwarks against Protestant influence, while Protestant rulers followed the Saxon and Swedish examples. This patchwork approach demonstrated that monastic dissolution wasn't inevitable, but rather a deliberate political choice that reflected each ruler's priorities and religious convictions. Denmark, under King Christian III, provided another model. Following his victory in the Danish Civil War in 1536, Christians systematically dissolved all monasteries and convents, using their wealth to fund educational reforms and strengthen royal finances. The Danish approach was notable for its relative restraint toward individual monks and nuns, many of whom were pensioned off rather than simply expelled. This more moderate approach would later influence how dissolution was implemented in some regions. These continental examples shared several common features that would prove crucial to understanding Henry's later actions. First, monastic dissolution was always connected to broader assertions of royal or princely authority over the church. Second, the economic benefits were immediate and substantial, providing rulers with resources to pursue ambitious political and military projects. Third, dissolution was often justified in terms of religious reform, even when the primary motivations were clearly political and financial. When Henry VIII turned his attention to Ireland, he faced challenges that made the English dissolution seem straightforward by comparison. Ireland in the 1530s was not a unified kingdom under effective royal control, but rather a complex patchwork of competing authorities, cultures, and loyalties. The Pale, the area around Dublin under direct English control, contained only a fraction of Ireland's monastic wealth. Beyond the Pale lay the territories of the Anglo-Irish lords, descendants of Norman settlers who had arrived in the 12th century. These powerful families, including the Fitzgeralds of Kildare and the Butlers of Ormond, had developed their own relationships with local monasteries over centuries. Many monastic houses served not just as religious centres, but as focal points for local identity and political organisation. Further complicating the situation were the Gaelic Irish regions, where ancient clan structures remained largely intact. Here, monasteries often served as centres of Gaelic culture, preserving Irish language, law, and traditions that predated English influence by centuries. The great monastic schools of places like Clonmacnoise and Glendalough were repositories of Irish learning that stretched back to the early Christian period. Henry's initial approach to Irish monasteries reflected these complexities. Rather than attempting immediate, wholesale dissolution, the Crown pursued a more gradual strategy. The Irish Reformation Parliament, which met from 1536 to 1537, passed legislation similar to the English Acts, but implementation proved far more challenging. The first major target was the wealthy monastery of Christ Church Cathedral in Dublin. Its dissolution in 1539 served as both a practical demonstration of royal authority and a symbolic statement about the new religious order. The cathedral's extensive lands were redistributed to loyal supporters of the Crown, creating a new class of Protestant landowners with a vested interest in maintaining the religious changes. However, as royal commissioners ventured beyond the Pale, they encountered fierce resistance. The observant Franciscans, who had been particularly active in opposing Henry's break with Rome, refused to acknowledge royal supremacy. Many simply went underground, continuing their religious activities in secret. Unlike in England, where most monks accepted pensions and quietly retired to private life, many Irish religious refused any compromise with the new order. The dissolution process in Ireland also revealed the deep connections between monastic houses and local political structures. The Cistercian Abbey of Mellifont in County Louth, one of Ireland's most important monastic centres, became a focal point for resistance to English religious policies. When the abbey was finally dissolved in 1539, many of its monks fled to continental Europe, where they continued their opposition to English rule from exile. The economic impact of dissolution in Ireland was also markedly different from the English experience. While English monastic lands generally passed to established gentry families who could effectively manage and develop them, Irish monastic properties often fell into the hands of new English settlers or government officials with little knowledge of local conditions. This contributed to a decline in agricultural productivity in some regions and increased tensions between new Protestant landowners and the predominantly Catholic population. Perhaps most significantly, the dissolution of Irish monasteries became intertwined with broader questions of cultural survival. Monasteries had served as centres for copying and preserving Irish manuscripts, maintaining bardic traditions, and providing education in the Irish language. Their closure represented not just a religious change, but a direct assault on Gaelic culture itself. By the end of Henry's reign, the dissolution of Irish monasteries remained incomplete and contested. While the Crown had successfully seized control of monastic properties within the Pale and in some Anglo-Irish territories, large portions of Ireland remained effectively beyond royal authority. The monastic question in Ireland would continue to complicate English rule for generations, contributing to a pattern of resistance that would define Irish-English relations for centuries to come. The continental precedents had shown that monastic dissolution could strengthen royal authority and provide substantial economic benefits. But the Irish experience demonstrated that success depended heavily on existing political structures and cultural conditions. Where rulers possessed effective authority and could rely on local support, dissolution proceeded relatively smoothly. Where traditional loyalties remained strong and alternative sources of authority persisted, the policy faced persistent resistance that could undermine its broader objectives. But by 1534, King Henry VIII had a problem that would make him see these revered institutions not as pillars of society, but as obstacles to his desperate ambitions. Henry's obsession with producing a male heir had already torn England from Rome and made him supreme head of the Church of England. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon had been annulled after 24 years. His new queen, Anne Boleyn, crowned amid scandal and international condemnation. Yet still, the promised son had not come. The royal treasury was hemorrhaging money on wars with France and Scotland, conflicts that would drain nearly £2 million from the royal coffers, and left Henry facing the humiliating prospect of bankruptcy. Meanwhile, the monasteries sat on vast wealth that could solve all his problems, annual incomes that dwarfed those of the greatest nobles, lands that stretched across every county in England, and treasuries filled with gold and silver accumulated over centuries. Taking down the monasteries would be no easy task. Institutions such as these do not go without a fight. Henry needed a man with a rare combination of intelligence, resilience, and utter ruthlessness. He found it in his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell. Emerging from humble beginnings as a blacksmith's son in Putney, Cromwell would become one of the most powerful men in Tudor England. A shrewd lawyer and merchant who had travelled across Europe, he possessed an exceptional understanding of both commerce and statecraft. Rising through Cardinal Wolsey's service, he caught Henry's attention with his administrative brilliance and ruthless pragmatism. Appointed as the king's chief minister, Cromwell orchestrated the English Reformation, not from religious conviction, but as a calculated political maneuver. He whispered in the king's ear, "Why should these monks live in luxury while the crown struggled?" The monasteries were corrupt, he argued, filled with lazy brothers who had forgotten their vows of poverty and chastity, who spent their days in idle ceremony while honest Englishmen starved. A commission of inquiry would surely find evidence of wrongdoing that would justify their closure and the seizure of their wealth. It was a perfect solution. Henry could solve his financial crisis while appearing to cleanse the church of corruption. But Cromwell had a secret that even the king didn't know. The fix was already in, and the investigators had been chosen not for their honesty, but for their willingness to find exactly what Cromwell wanted them to find. The Valor Ecclesiasticus of 1535 was presented to Parliament and the public as an impartial survey of monastic wealth, a careful accounting of assets and revenues designed to ensure fair taxation of religious houses. But it was actually a death warrant disguised as an audit, a comprehensive catalogue of everything Henry intended to seize. Cromwell's commissioners travelled from monastery to monastery with the methodical efficiency of tax collectors, meticulously cataloguing every silver chalice, every illuminated manuscript, every acre of productive farmland, every annual rent payment from tenants who had farmed monastic lands for generations. The numbers were staggering. The monasteries were worth hundreds of thousands per year in regular income alone, equivalent to hundreds of millions in today's money, not counting the immense value of their lands, buildings, and accumulated treasures. To a king drowning in debt, facing potential rebellion from nobles who refused to lend him more money, it must have seemed like divine providence had placed the solution to all his problems within his reach. Yet as the commissioners worked their way across England, staying in monastery guest houses and eating at monastic tables, they began to uncover something unexpected that threatened to derail Cromwell's carefully laid plans. Many of the monasteries weren't the dens of corruption Cromwell had promised to find. Instead, they found hospitals caring for the sick with skill and compassion that surpassed anything available in London, schools educating the poor with a curriculum more comprehensive than that available to most nobles, and scriptoriums preserving the written heritage of Western civilization with devotion that bordered on the sacred. Some commissioners began to have second thoughts about the mission they had been sent to accomplish, sending private letters to Cromwell expressing doubt about the wisdom of destroying institutions that clearly served the common good. But Cromwell had anticipated this problem, and his solution would prove more ruthless than anyone imagined. Dr. Richard Layton and Dr. Thomas Lee, Cromwell's most trusted investigators and men whose loyalty had been purchased with promises of rich preferments in the new order, received special instructions that differed dramatically from the official commission. These secret orders revealed the true nature of their mission. They were not investigators seeking truth, but executioners armed with legal documents. Where evidence of corruption didn't exist, it would be created through creative interpretation of innocent activities. Where monks protested their innocence, they would be threatened with charges of treason, a crime that carried the penalty of death by hanging, drawing, and quartering. Lee, in particular, seemed to relish his work, writing gleefully to Cromwell about the superstitious relics he was destroying and the idle monks he was interrogating. At Langdon Abbey in Kent, he boasted of finding evidence of sexual misconduct, namely that some monks had female servants, a practice that had been common and accepted for centuries. His reports dripped with salacious details designed to scandalize readers and justify the harshest measures against the religious communities. Yet even as this elaborate deception was being orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign, genuine resistance was beginning to stir in the most unexpected quarters. Abbot Richard Whiting of Glastonbury Abbey was 78 years old when Cromwell's commissioners arrived at his gates in 1539, their black horses and armed escorts casting long shadows across the ancient courtyard where pilgrims had once gathered to venerate the relics of England's patron saints. He had served his monastery faithfully for 15 years, overseeing repairs to the ancient buildings, expanding the library's collection of rare manuscripts, and maintaining the abbey's reputation as a centre of learning and charity that attracted scholars from across Europe. His hands, gnarled with age, but still steady, had signed countless charters granting aid to the poor, approving scholarships for promising students, and authorizing the medical treatment of plague victims when other institutions turned them away. Glastonbury was no ordinary monastery. It claimed to be the burial place of King Arthur and Queen Guinevere, the site where Joseph of Arimathea had first brought Christianity to Britain, and its library contained manuscripts that traced English history back to the earliest Christian missions. In the 8 centuries since its founding, it had seen Saxon rule, the Viking invasion, and the Norman conquest. The abbey's considerable annual income made it one of the richest religious houses in England, but Whiting had used this wealth responsibly, maintaining schools that educated over 300 boys annually, and hospitals that treated thousands of patients without charge. When the old abbot refused to surrender his abbey voluntarily, declaring that he held his office from God rather than the king, he sealed not just his own fate, but the fate of England's most sacred site. Cromwell's response was swift and merciless. If Whiting would not cooperate, he would be removed by force, and his resistance would serve as an example to any other religious superior who dared to defy the king's will. The charges against Whiting were so transparently fabricated that they might have been comical if the stakes weren't so deadly, representing the cynical abuse of legal process that characterized the entire dissolution. He was accused of hiding gold and silver from the king's commissioners, treasure that conveniently could never be found, despite extensive searches that involved breaking down walls and digging up floors throughout the abbey. The supposed evidence for this charge consisted mainly of the discovery of some old plate that had been stored in a chest, items that Whiting claimed were being kept safe from theft, and which any reasonable person would have recognized as prudent housekeeping rather than treasonous concealment. Most damning of all, he was accused of treason for possessing a book arguing against the king's divorce, a book that had somehow remained hidden in his possession for 5 years after such materials had been banned, despite repeated searches of the abbey by royal commissioners. The trial was a foregone conclusion, conducted by judges who had been hand-picked for their loyalty to the king rather than their commitment to justice. But Whiting's dignity in the face of certain death created something Cromwell hadn't anticipated: a martyr whose story would inspire resistance for generations to come. On the 15th of November, 1539, the last abbot of Glastonbury was dragged to the top of Glastonbury Tor, that ancient hill that had been sacred to Britons long before Christianity arrived, and hanged, drawn, and quartered in sight of the abbey he had died defending, his quarters displayed on the abbey gates as a warning to any who might dare to follow his example. The execution of a 78-year-old abbot through this barbaric method exemplified Henry's ruthless determination to crush monastic resistance. The physical frailty of an elderly religious leader devoted to prayer and contemplation made the prolonged torture particularly horrific. Such cruelty demonstrated that neither age, piety, nor decades of faithful service would shield those who opposed the crown's ecclesiastical revolution. But his execution would trigger a chain of events that would threaten to bring down the entire dissolution project and expose the true cost of Henry's ambitions. What Cromwell hadn't anticipated was that the brutal execution of respected abbots like Whiting would transform local opposition into national rebellion that threatened to consume the entire kingdom. The Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536 had already shown how deeply the monasteries were loved by ordinary people. 40,000 rebels had marched under banners depicting Christ on the cross, demanding the restoration of the religious houses and the punishment of Cromwell himself. The rebellion had drawn support from every level of society, from poor farmers who had lost their only source of medical care to great lords who saw their ancient traditions being swept away by upstart bureaucrats. At its head stood Robert Aske, a Yorkshire lawyer whose silver tongue had convinced an army that their cause was just. Their demands were simple: restore the monasteries, remove heretical advisors from court, and return England to the true faith. For weeks, Henry watched from London as his northern realm slipped from his grasp. The rebels took city after city, Pontefract, York, Hull, without shedding a single drop of blood. They were pilgrims, not soldiers. They sought salvation, not conquest. And so the king did what Henry Tudor did best. He lied. Through his envoy, the Duke of Norfolk, Henry offered the rebels everything they desired: a pardon for all involved, a parliament in York to hear their grievances, his royal word that their demands would be considered with all due gravity. Robert Aske believed him. They all believed him. The pilgrimage disbanded. 40,000 souls returned to their homes, their hearts light with hope. They had won without violence. They had changed the course of a kingdom through faith alone. But Henry VIII was not a man to be dictated to by his subjects. The moment the rebels laid down their banners, he began his revenge. The arrests began in winter. Norfolk, the same man who had promised pardons, now carried warrants for treason. The leaders who had trusted in royal mercy found themselves dragged from their beds in the cold January night. Robert Aske was invited to court as an honoured guest. He came believing he would advise the king on northern affairs. Instead, he was thrown into the Tower of London, his trust rewarded with shackles. On the 16th day of May, 1539, they stood before the king's commissioners: Sir Robert Constable, who had opened the gates of Hull; Sir Thomas Percy, brother to the Earl of Northumberland; Sir John Bulmer and his son Ralph; Sir Francis Bigod, Margaret Chain, Bulmer's mistress; George Lumley, and Robert Aske himself, the gentleman who had dared to lead 40,000 against their anointed king. High treason. The charge was read. The verdict was predetermined: hanged, drawn, and quartered, the traditional punishment for those who dared defy the crown. On the 25th day of May, a Friday in Whitsun week, the executions began. Sir John Bulmer and Sir Stephen Hamerton were hanged and beheaded. Nicholas Tempest, Dr. Cockerell, the former Abbot of Fountains, and Dr. Pickering were drawn through the streets of London to Tyburn. There, before the jeering mob, they were hanged until nearly dead, then cut down. Still breathing, still conscious, they watched as their bodies were opened and their bowels drawn out. Only then were they allowed to die. Their heads were set upon London Bridge as a warning to any who might think to challenge the king's supremacy. Margaret Chain met a different fate. Drawn to Smithfield, she was burned alive according to the law for treasonous women. The chronicler noted she was a very fair creature and beautiful, as if her beauty might somehow soften the horror of her death. But Henry saved his cruelest revenge for Robert Aske. The man who had led the pilgrimage was returned to York, not as the honoured guest he had once been promised, but as a condemned traitor. There, in sight of the very walls where he had once proclaimed the righteousness of their cause, Aske was hanged in chains from Clifford's Tower. He was left to die slowly, his body writhing in agony for days until death finally granted him mercy. 200 souls lost their lives to Henry's vengeance. 200 men and women who had believed in the word of their king, who had trusted in royal mercy, who had dared to hope that their sovereign might listen to their pleas. The Pilgrimage of Grace had sought to save England's soul. Instead, it revealed the absence of Henry Tudor's. In crushing those who had shown him mercy, the king demonstrated that his word was worthless, his promises were lies, and his reign was built not on divine right, but on terror. History would remember the pilgrimage of grace, not as a rebellion, but as a betrayal. Not by those who rose in righteous cause, but by the king who promised them forgiveness and delivered only death. But the continuing closures and the execution of popular abbots were creating new flashpoints of resistance across the kingdom that made the pilgrimage of grace look like a prelude to insurgency. In Lincolnshire, in Yorkshire, in Cumberland, and even in the supposedly loyal counties of the south, the king's commissioners were being met with armed resistance that ranged from angry crowds blocking their access to monasteries to organised attacks on their convoys as they transported seized wealth back to London. The dissolution was supposed to strengthen Henry's position by filling his treasury and rewarding his supporters with grants of former monastic land. But instead, it was threatening to tear his kingdom apart in a civil war that could destroy the Tudor dynasty itself. The great abbey churches that had taken centuries to build were systematically demolished, their stones sold to local builders who would use them to construct manor houses for the new Protestant elite who had profited from the destruction of the old order. Glastonbury's magnificent nave, once one of the largest buildings in medieval Europe, was reduced to the romantic ruins that still stand today, its destruction so complete that visitors can barely imagine the splendour that once existed there. Fountains Abbey's soaring columns, masterpieces of Cistercian architecture that had inspired generations of builders, were toppled and broken up for roadstone, their beauty sacrificed to the practical needs of a kingdom that had forgotten how to value anything that couldn't be converted into immediate cash. In less than 4 years, England lost architectural treasures that had taken centuries to build and could never be replaced, a cultural catastrophe that would leave the country impoverished in ways that are still felt today. The human cost was equally devastating. Thousands of monks and nuns were turned out into a world that had no place for them, their skills obsolete, their vows meaningless in the new order that valued profit over prayer and power over piety. Some died in poverty as they wandered the country seeking work that didn't exist. Others lived as beggars, former abbots reduced to serving as parish priests in remote villages where their learning was wasted, former abbesses working as servants in the houses of those who had bought their former lands and demolished their former homes. By 1540, it was over. The last monastery had been closed, the last abbot pensioned off or executed, the last sacred relic thrown onto the fire. England had been transformed in ways that contemporaries could barely comprehend. An entire way of life that had existed for 1,000 years had been wiped out in less than a decade. The immediate financial benefits to the crown were substantial. Henry's debts were cleared, his wars funded, his new Protestant nobility rewarded with grants of former monastic land. But the long-term consequences would prove far more complex and troubling than anyone anticipated. The destruction of the monasteries had created a social crisis that would take generations to resolve. The poor, who had relied on monastic charity, found themselves with nowhere to turn. The sick, who had been treated in monastic infirmaries, discovered that the new Protestant church offered prayers but no hospitals. The schools that had educated the children of merchants and farmers were gone. Within a generation, literacy rates in rural England had stagnated, and social mobility, once possible through monastic education, had become the exclusive privilege of the wealthy. The dissolution had been sold as religious reform, but its effect was to create a more stratified, less charitable, and ultimately less Christian society. Cromwell himself would not long survive his greatest triumph. Within months of the dissolution's completion, he would fall victim to the same royal paranoia that had driven the destruction of the monasteries. Henry VIII, always eager to blame others for the consequences of his own choices, would have his chief minister executed on charges of treason in 1540. Cromwell was a convenient scapegoat for the excesses of the dissolution, but historians have found Henry's signatures on the death warrants, his handwriting in the margins of the dissolution orders. There was no hiding from the truth. The destruction had been his will, carried out by his agents for his benefit. Today, the ruins of England's great monasteries stand as monuments to one of history's most successful acts of cultural destruction. Visitors to Tintern Abbey or Revol see only romantic ruins, but they are looking at the remains of a civilization that was deliberately obliterated. The manuscripts that burned could have told us about medieval medicine, astronomy, and literature. The hospitals that were closed could have evolved into a healthcare system that might have prevented centuries of suffering. The schools that were destroyed could have created a literate population centuries before the Industrial Revolution made it necessary. Instead, England chose a different path, one that prioritized royal power over social welfare, political expediency over cultural preservation, and immediate gain over long-term prosperity. The monasteries were dissolved, but the questions their destruction raised about power, authority, and the price of change remain as relevant today as they were 5 centuries ago. In the end, Henry VIII got his Reformation, but England got something it never asked for: a lesson in how quickly centuries of civilization can be reduced to ruins when power is divorced from responsibility and ambition from conscience.